Drones are even more interesting on the inside than the outside. After I dropped the two ambushers down the tunnel, the one with the projectile weapon managed to survive, barely, and I managed to interrogate it before it succumbed to its wounds. From what I got out of it, the drone who followed me is a tracker, and after it followed me to the tunnel entrance it called for its friend because they owned a gun. Apparently it had at first just planned to take money from an easy mark, but when I traveled back and forth between Ashwood Street and the tunnels it had suspected I had something more valuable. Perhaps one of those gizmos that Jasper had mentioned. My amateur autopsy of the two drones revealed quite a few things, namely that drones also have internal variants. Between the both of them I got a good idea of what a normal drone might be like, which raised questions: why have several redundant organs but only one heart? And the tracker drone specifically had some interesting modifications, namely to its olfactory sense organs. Whereas the drone with the gun seemed to have a normal concentration of cells to detect smells, similar to what I used, the tracker had nearly 40 times as many cells, as well as extra modifications to its processing center, which I assume were to handle the extra information processing. Normally I would call this level of sensory intake to be overkill, but if it works, it works. I was sure I had outrun the tracker by a large enough margin to lose it, but with this powerful of a sensory organ it could probably smell the barest residue left behind from when my feet hit the ground. I'd have to think of a countermeasure. Other than the organs and enhancements, I also learned that drones are much better eating than rats. Lots of fats, oils, and useful cell structures, which isn't surprising if Maggie's burgers are any indication of their normal eating habits. Between the two I had more than replenished my missing mass and increased my energy reserves even further. At this rate I would probably have to recalculate my norms for resource management. Obviously the whitecoats had kept me somewhat starved. Once I was done disposing of the remains, making sure to record the tracker design for later, I examined the gun, being extra careful to point it away from my core. It seemed like a simple enough device. A handle to hold it, the hole where the projectile came from, and a little lever which was most likely the trigger. Attempting to test the weapon wound up with nothing happening when I pulled the trigger. After I fiddled with all the movable parts to see if that would make it work, I eventually gave up and dismantled it. The problem was immediately apparent: while it looked functional on the outside, the insides were rusted and ill-maintained. It was basically just a fused lump of metal at this point. I did recover what was most likely the ammo supply, 2 small canisters filled with a volatile chemical powder. These I dismantled and absorbed since the chemicals were more useful to me as raw resources, although I did record its composition like I did the tracker design. Done with my examination of the weapon, I again had to adjust my disguise. Now that I had more mass, I had to compress myself a bit more to maintain the look. I wanted to continue to use my current young appearance, as it seemed to trigger a cooperative instinct in some drones like Jasper and Maggie, and caused other drones like my would-be ambushers to underestimate me. While it had been the reason I was targeted in the first place, even that was to my benefit. If opportunists like these two drones had to rely on targeting the weak, then they would be no match for me, and since they did not seem to have the support of the general drone network, they would most likely not be missed. Hopefully more would fall for the same trap. Disguise adjusted, I left the tunnels to go to Maggie's, but when I arrived the diner was dark, and a closed sign was hung on the door. I had spent too long examining the drones and Maggie had closed the diner for the night. Disappointment. Instead I trudged back to the tunnels, deciding to hibernate until the sun rose again. At least, I assumed it would. I was still having trouble with the mechanics of the sun. A giant ball of flame that rose out of the ground and then traveled across the ceiling. Would it rise from the other direction next cycle, or did it make some loop through a different area before coming back around? The shape of this space was odd, very confusing. I had noticed being confused more and more often lately. When I had been walking to Maggie's I had actually tripped, had to be more careful about that. And that blade drone. How do those blades work? Nearly cut me to pieces. Bite-sized pieces. All the different organs and pieces. Why so many filter organs? Confusing. I want a burger. Human.exe shutdown. Abnormal process activity detected, analyzing. Drone processor center analogous to human.exe processor requirements. Drone cycle logged at 24 hours. Drone rest cycle estimated at 6 to 10 hours. Former uptime of human.exe, 144.35 hours. Estimated recovery time, 7.4 hours. Combat potential critically reduced while human.exe inactive, hibernation recommended. It retreated to the tunnels and slept. I woke up in the tunnels, just a little ways off from the entrance, my memories of the previous day surfacing quickly. Unpleasant. Apparently I couldn't keep myself active indefinitely. I hadn't noticed the problem before because I sometimes hibernated to conserve resources, but since the yellow fur incident I had been operating almost continuously to absorb more details and plan my escape. Up until now I used extra blood flow and cell renewal to compensate, but apparently that wouldn't work in the long run. Annoying, I finally get enough resources to operate continuously and it turns out there is a hard limit. But Maggie's should be open now. I suddenly realized. I quickly ascended to the surface and made my way to the diner. When I entered the diner was a lot more crowded, and a different drone dressed similarly to Maggie introduced itself before seating me at the counter this time. When I asked where Maggie was, the waitress told me that Maggie was cooking in the back and didn't normally deal directly with customers. It gave me a menu with lots of symbols and thanks to the pictures it wasn't hard to find what I wanted. Between what I had saved and what I pulled off the drones I had enough for the listed prices and I ordered myself another tofu burger. While I waited I casually observed the busy diner. Several of the drones eating were combat drones and I avoided staring too long. This was apparently rude, and in a corner was a large screen displaying talking drones. No sound came from them, but underneath scrolling symbols went by. As been confirmed, Friday will be the last day of school before they shut down for the summer. Fortress City officials would like to remind all citizens to report suspicious occurrences to Central as soon as possible, as well as to wear identification armbands to facilitate police response. In other news, I was getting better with reading the symbols. But some of the words still escaped me. I didn't know what Friday was. But I had seen Fortress City printed around often enough to realize it meant this particular giant hive structure that the drones and I were living in. Slowly I was learning which symbols corresponded with which words. Eventually the waitress came with my food. And I ate it as slowly as I could, though I couldn't resist taking 2 packets of the drink mix to go with it. As I ate I heard a lot of drones talking about a variety of topics: seas, cowls, capes, Hellion, villains, Central, those damn armbands, Mutavis, Wandergeist, Turbo, Heroes, the bus explosion caused by the Merc yesterday, and a large amount of various other miscellaneous events. But the one that really dominated conversation was that odd summer was starting. Apparently this was regarded as generally bad, mostly by the combat drones. However, several drones seemed excited about the increased opportunity it would bring. Once I was done eating I paid the bill. I was really surprised that the norm is to pay afterwards, and began heading to Ashwood Estate. I mulled over what I had overheard in the diner. Apparently this odd summer was a period of time marked by uncertainty, which fit with why Jasper would deem it necessary to warn a young, inexperienced drone about it. I was impressed. He had warned me about it before the general drone population was informed. Even just walking along outside, nearly every conversation I overheard was at least mentioning it, if not dominated by it. Whereas yesterday it had only been mentioned by drones sparingly. It seems Jasper knew his stuff. I decided to not change my plans and continue to 512 Ashwood Street to seek a job. After seeing how much killing just 2 drones filled my mass, energy, and money reserves, I had questioned the necessity of seeking alternate ways to make money. But if what I heard in the diner was true, having a stable job during the odd summer time period was an advantage. And there was a possibility of food rationing and food shortages, neither of which I liked the sound of. Best to secure stable resources while I could. My trip to Audiobooks was less eventful than last time, but much more interesting. I noticed several of the physically modified drones, mostly combat models, wearing bands of yellow material around their upper arms, with a black symbol depicting a drone's hand imprinted on the band. Maybe a faction indicator, but this change was too swift and widespread. More likely it had something to do with odd summer. The other new thing was that every now and then I would see a drone wearing a face cover. Usually just a simple dark covering over the eyes. These I saw mostly around the multi-level structures near Audiobooks. And other drones gave them a wide berth. Once I saw a drone in full coverings, much like the Guardian, loitering around an intersection. Its coverings were black with yellow highlights, and a full shell over its head. After standing around and turning its head as if looking for something, it suddenly disappeared. No. Wait. It just moved very, very fast. I barely caught the blur of motion as it left. Out of sight in moments. Estimated threat, high. How it managed to move that fast was, of course, a mystery. Everything I knew about physical laws seemed to be wrong lately. If that drone attacked, I wasn't sure how to counter that kind of speed. At the very least, the other drones hadn't acted scared at its presence. Merely curious. So hopefully it wasn't a threat I'd have to deal with. I continued walking while pondering countermeasures. Up steps and over walkways. Until I finally wound up in front of 512, Ashwood Street. Again. There still weren't any indicators that this building was special, or of what exactly a job here might entail. But the entrance was unlocked when I pushed on the door handle. Inside was a mostly empty room with white walls and a polished floor made of stone tiles. At the back of the room was a set of metal stairs that spiraled into the level above and below. Along the back and side walls were several doors. Most were closed, but one door to the right was propped open. The only other object was a large wooden counter in the middle of the room that twisted in a circle, leaving room for the one drone in the room to sit in a chair. The drone in question was sitting with its feet up on the counter, its attention on a smartphone it held. It was a physically modified drone. Tough defensive scales around the neck and up the sides of the head that stopped at its short black hair. And its scaled hands sported sharp, hooked claws that it nevertheless adeptly used to tap at the phone. Along with its natural biological modifications, it also sported many artificial modifications, such as inscribed skin symbols and shutter metal loops embedded in its ears and nose. As it was the only drone here, I walked up to ask it directions. "Is this? You look lost. The nearest high school is quite a few blocks from here. Take a right when you exit and keep walking." Odd. "Is this 512 Ashwood St. The drone sighed. Then turned its eyes to me. "Yes. This is 512, Ashwood Street. What's it to you?" "I was told I could find a job here." And just who told you that?" Jasper had asked me not to tell who sent me. His goodwill was currently worth more than a possible job. The drone sighed again. "It was that weasel Jasper, right? Look, brat. This isn't a babysitting service. Go back to Dash." "Lily, is that a prospective hire I hear you talking to?" said a new voice that came from the open door. Lily grit its teeth and answered. "No, Sandra. It's just a lost kid. Actually, I am here for a job." I replied directly to the new drone. This one seemed far more amiable. "Oh. Well then, send them in, Lily." Lily rolled its eyes and merely gestured to the room with a clawed hand before it proceeded to once again ignore me while tapping at its phone. I headed over to the open door. Inside was a drone in one of the black/white suits. It had long black hair and wore spectacles like Dr. Mason had. The table it was sitting at was covered in papers as well as an electronic screen hooked up to several other devices. Most of it looked similar to what was in the White Coat's test chambers. "Hello. Please come in and have a seat. It's nice to see someone come in early on the first day. It usually takes people a few days to figure out where we are. So then. Just to confirm you're here for a job position, yes?" "That is right," I answered. "Splendid. Now I have a few questions I need to ask you. And a few things to inform you about. First of all, at no point during this interview are you obligated to tell me your real name or personal information. You may choose to keep those private from the company for your entire duration with us. From this opening interview all the way to retirement if you choose to stay with us. Do you understand? Well, that's perfect for me." "Yes." Second point of business. Were you informed of the nature of this job position? "No. I was only told that I could earn money." "Oh dear. Well then, don't be shocked. But this is a minion position for the supervillain known as Hellion. If that is a problem, know that you are free to go, no questions asked." I didn't have any problem with that. However, I also didn't know what any of it meant either. I don't think I have a problem with it. But could you explain to me more about what a minion position entails?" The drone perked up at this. "Oh, of course. Well, basically a minion acts as support for a supervillain in whatever endeavor they are working on. While they fight it out on the front lines, minions work in the background and take care of all the little details to make sure the task gets done. It's not as glamorous or showy. But it is safer and you get paid. Makes sense so far? Seemed simple enough. Yes. Good. Now in the case of Hellion, she runs things as a business, providing training and equipment to minions. And other villains pay her in order to utilize her minions. Of course the minions sometimes do jobs for Hellion directly. Some of these jobs are regular villain endeavors. But Hellion also controls the territory around Ashwood St. And you might be asked to help secure it or make sure everything is running smoothly. Understand all that? Yes. Good. Now before we go further, there are a few things you should know. As the activities of a supervillain are not strictly legal, there is a risk of both legal consequences and bodily harm up to and including death while on the job. Hellion tries to minimize these. And she has both doctors and lawyers on call. But there is always that risk when dealing with superpowers and capes. Knowing this, is this job still something you are interested in? I wasn't sure why it was warning me about injury or death while on the job. Injury and death were constant threats even without dealing with abnormal drones. Maybe these legal risks were something really bad. Either way, if they were providing extra resources, it was a net win for me. Yes. I am very much still interested in this. Excellent. I must say it's nice seeing the younger generation being so decisive. Oh. Which reminds me. You are 18 or older, right? 18. Cycles as in Operation Timies. I definitely was older than 18 cycles. Yes. Oh good. I wondered for a second since you look so young. Not skipping school, are you? School, that was the place Lily had mentioned. I hadn't considered a young drone might be required to go somewhere. Maybe if I. Kidding. Kidding. No worries, even if you are. I won't tell, said Sandra as she winked and laughed. Ah. A joke. I still wasn't able to recognize those. After that, Sandra had me read through a bunch of documents and give some verbal confirmations that I understood them. Of course I didn't understand everything. But I got the main gist of it with some context clues from Sandra. Apparently Hellion was a member of the supervillain faction, who were enemies of the superhero faction. Sandra had me give verbal confirmation and check mark a document that said that if I was a spy, nothing I learned was admissible in a court of law. I'm not sure why they wouldn't just try to kill a spy if they found one. But many of these drone rules made little sense to me. Like how both factions used anomalous powers. But the superhero faction was a security force for the city, and would attempt to capture supervillains and minions, rather than kill them. It seemed counterintuitive to me. But at least since I was working for a villain I was under no such restriction. There were a couple more things to go through. Mainly, insurance. And setting up a P.O. box where my money would be sent if I didn't pick it up. But eventually we came to an interesting document that asked if I wanted to declare a power. Declare a poweries. Minion work doesn't require you have one. And you don't need to declare one even if you have it. But if you want to use your power while on the job it needs to be declared. Small things like lifting boxes with super strength are fine. But if a cape tries to arrest you, you aren't allowed to use your power to try and resist arrest if you haven't declared it. That includes Benedicti. And Mutavis mutations as well, mind you. Minions are restricted from using powers isn't that dangerous. Well, as I mentioned, the heroes will mostly try to arrest or restrain before resorting to lethal force. The problem is they can't do that without information on their target. If they tried to go in for arrests on what they thought were normal people and someone started shooting lasers or whatever else, the next time they try they will just skip to using lethal force. This is a safety measure for the minions who don't have superpowers. And breaking this rule has some hefty penalties, including the withdrawal of support from Hellion. Plus, if the heroes find out you took advantage of this rule, they tend to throw the book at you afterwards. So the heroes follow these rules too well. It's more like an unspoken rule when it comes to the heroes. We play by some rules. They don't resort to lethal force. Win/win as long as everyone plays ball. Interesting concept. Using rules to mitigate the damage of conflict. As for whether or not to declare a power, I wasn't sure. Not declaring and staying hidden seemed safer. But at the same time, pretending to be a minion with powers would be better for my disguise if I ever needed to use my abilities openly. Sandra must have noticed my hesitance because she continued saying, "If you do declare a power, there are some additional benefits. We handle any special equipment you need to utilize your power. And you get paid more in compensation for the added risk. A minion might be required to use their power to complete the job. But it will still be the villains on the front lines. You still work in the background. Does equipment include special nutritional requirements? Absolutely. Then yes. I would like to declare a power." There was only one more paper added from declaring a power. Surprisingly, I didn't even need to say what kind of power it was, which made me immensely happy. Only that I had one. Sandra assured me this would be explained in more detail at an orientation that would take place on Saturday. Well, then I think that's mostly everything. There's just one last thing to take care of," said Sandra, slipping me the final piece of paper. "Since we don't use real names professionally, you'll need a call sign we can use for you." A call sign? Oh, it can be anything. An old nickname. A nonsense word. Something that's important to you or means something to you. It's pretty popular to use your future supervillain name among the newbies, since a lot of minions go on to become independent later. Choose whatever you like and I'll go get you a mask while you decide. A name I get to choose, and it can be anything interesting. I considered it a little before writing down the word for my favorite thing. Luckily, I knew the spelling for it. Sandra came back with a plain brown box in one hand. I handed her the paper, and when she read it she smiled before opening the box and handing it to me. Inside was an artificial head shell. Or mask, I guess is the term. It was made of a hard, bone-white material that would cover the entire head, with 2 holes for the eyes covered in translucent material darkened to black. The only other feature was the seams that allowed it to adjust and conform to the size of the wearer. "Well then, Tofu," said Sandra. "It's my pleasure to welcome you to Hellions Henchman." Sandra showed me how to use the mask. Despite being a rigid shell, it was adjustable with some controls on the inside of the faceplate. Pressing a few buttons in combination allowed for adjustments to be made, while locking it in the preferred shape otherwise. Technically, I could just adjust my own head to the mask. But I appreciated the well-done design. After making sure I could adjust the mask myself, Sandra showed me how the mask could collapse into a portable form that made it easy to carry. As a bonus, it could even receive messages that would alert me to when and where a job was happening that I needed to get to, and it received messages with no physical medium. Astounding. Sandra told me that the mask would display the time and location of the orientation on Saturday, and sent me on my way. I tucked the mask under my shirt and left, passing by a preoccupied Lily on the way out. Now I just needed to map more of the area, and maybe figure out when Saturday is. I had already figured out that they had a set of named days on a rotating schedule. Such an odd system. Why the names? I just didn't know what the order of the days was. For now I decided to just stick to mapping more of the area. That way when they sent the signal to my mask I'd know where to go. I'd start with this school I heard so many drones mention. It seemed important. I headed right as I left the building, following Lily's instructions. If I was properly mapping my surroundings, then I was currently heading west, along Ashwood Estate. To the north of the area near 512 was Maggie's Diner and the tunnel entrance. And everything was still located in just the section of the city labeled E13. I had to hand it to the drones. If nothing else, they knew how to build big. Ashwood Estate continued for a long time. The numbers on the buildings counted down gradually, a few were on the other side of the street for some reason. And when I reached building 012 I found a massive structure. The width of 2 blocks and 10 levels high. The entire thing built with obvious reinforcements done to the support structures. I might have thought it was some kind of protective structure for resources if it weren't for the symbols by the entrance that declared the building to be Clement High School. Neat. So this was the place where young drones came from, or maybe it was just the training facility. I was curious at what kinds of tests drones had to go through. A place this large probably contained thousands of drone young. Getting yellow furs or brown furs for all of them to fight didn't seem cost-effective. Although maybe they fought them in groups. The drones did indeed value teamwork, and doubling up would lower the cost substantially. Plus, the non-combat drones probably didn't need to participate in the combat tests. I wandered over to the main entrance while I pondered these questions. A decision that turned out to be a mistake. "Hey kid. What do you think you're doing out here, Oops?" I turned to the sound of the voice and found what was an obvious security drone. Although I didn't recognize the outfit. Probably belonged specifically to the school. It walked up to me and glared. Its mouth turned down in a deep frown. No weapon detected. Estimated threat, minimum. Trying to skip Hayu can't even wait a few more days, school's almost out anyways. I'm not assigned to a school. I don't go here. Aha. Sure. Well then just show me your ID. And you can be on your way then. I of course didn't have my own ID. Most likely that was the identification card that I had found on the drones I ate. Technically I still had those IDs, but they were useless to me right now. I'd have to see about finding a solution to this later. If I managed to extract myself from this situation. I forgot my ID. Well then I can't let you leave now, can I? Come on. You'll wait in the office for now. And none of your back talk. Dunno why you seniors always try to ditch before lunch even starts. If you want to leave campus for lunch, just wait until it starts and then present your ID. I don't care if you graduate in a few more days. Until then you follow the rules. Wait, lunch. I happily followed the security guard into the building. It led me down several corridors and then left me at a seating area in the office, warning me not to leave before the bell rang before it walked away, grumbling under its breath the whole time. Several drones went by, all seemingly very busy with paperwork, although most seemed to be using flat screens rather than paper. One drone did ask why I was waiting in the office, but telling it I was told to wait for the bell seemed to appease it. I waited patiently in the office, counting the seconds. I was looking forward to tasting the senior food. Eventually an alarm rang out which surprised me. But this must have been the bell the guard spoke of because none of the drones reacted badly. I decided to ask a drone for directions. I didn't want to get lost in such a large structure. The one I talked to gave me an odd look, but pointed me in the direction of a cafeteria. As I walked I quickly noticed the drone young. They were mostly smaller than the adult drones. And I slowly adjusted my height to be more around the average. I'd return it to something more comfortable later. From the flow of the crowd I quickly narrowed in on the cafeteria. Apparently it was just a very large room with enough tables for the drones to sit. Not surprising considering the sheer amount of drones. I had seen a few young drones out in the city, but these were normally very small, young with a caretaker. I had yet to see where they made new drones, although it was probably unlikely that I ever would. If there was a progenitor for the drone somewhere, it would obviously be heavily guarded. On one wall of the cafeteria was a side room where a line was forming. I quickly entered the line as well, shuffling forward slowly with the rest of them. While I waited I observed the young drones at the tables. It was really useful to see so many interactions at once. One oddity I noticed was that the young drones tended to cluster with other similar drones. Especially in the case of the combat drones. Those ones almost exclusively stuck together in groups with other modified drones. And regular drones avoided them. This was more like the behavior in Central. The drones around Ashwood and Maggie's diner hadn't really seemed to care. But the ones in Central definitely had. I resolved to be extra careful about the social hierarchy at play here. I just wanted to get my food and get out. The line moved forward slowly but surely. And I was pulled from my observations by the large drone at the line's terminus which was overseeing transactions. It took the ID from the drone in front of me and then swiped it into a device that beeped before giving it back. Then it was my turn. And I didn't have an ID. I forgot my ID. Today. Then it's $2. It replied. Obviously bored. I didn't have $2. I had $1.10. Here. Use mine. Came a voice behind me. I turned to the young drone that had spoken. It was tall with pale skin. And had long, somewhat oily looking, black hair. In its hand it held its ID, which it was offering to me. It's okay for me to use yours, I asked. Yeah, sure. The school's closing on Friday anyway. I gratefully took the ID from the young drone and tried to hand it to the overseer. You aren't supposed to share those, it said. Come on, MS. B. They are already cutting 2 weeks off of school. I had the month pass, replied the young drone. The overseer grunted and swiped the ID twice before handing it back to the young drone and waving us forward. Thanks, MS. B. You're the best, said the young drone. MS. B merely rolled its eyes and grunted. The young drone and I retreated. quickly following. The line again, but with the young drone in the lead. I copied it in taking a tray and eating utensils. Before taking small cups and platters of food to go on the tray. The food was odd-looking. Mostly cut into the little squares and rectangles that drones enjoyed. The food came in muted colors. And seemed to favor a soggy texture. A taste test would be the deciding factor. Speaking of which, I needed to secure a seating arrangement. Thanks again for helping me. No worries, man. MS. B is gruff, but she rarely makes a fuss of it. My name is Mikey, by the way. Mine is Tofu. Tofu for real, no. That is what others call me. Ha. No worries. I've heard weirder nicknames. Come on. I see my friend from here. You're new, right? You can sit with us. Yes. How could you tell? You've still got that first day look. Bad timing, dude. You just got here and they are closing it down early. I really didn't like how easily some drones picked up on these small details. At least being new was not suspicious enough to raise alarms in this case. It led me over to a table where a few other drones were seated and placed its tray down next to a short drone with curly red hair and spectacles before addressing it. Hey Tim. What's up? Jennifer Hartley triggered. Responded the short drone while poking at its food with a plastic utensil. Yeah dude, I know. It's been all over the school all day. How could I not? The odds of gaining a superpower are over 1 in a million. What was that now? Gaining superpowers? Okay. Here we go again. Said Mikey. It specifically caught my gaze and rolled its eyes. 1 in a million. But those numbers spike during odd summer. Some studies have shown it can get up to 1 in 1,000 depending on the situation. Said Tim. That's a rough estimate. Of a possible high. On a single report done by Quacks Tim. There's about 5,000 students at this school. So technically by the end of odd summer at least 5 people in this school will trigger. And one already has. Tim. Even with those odds that's like less than a 0.1% chance that you get powers. That any of us get powers. Heck. Maybe some other school will get 9 and we don't get even 1 more. So why did it have to be Jennifer? She's a jerk. Exclaimed Tim. Ha. I can think of a few better words to describe her than that. A word. B word. C word. I could probably make it down most of the alphabet if I really tried for it. That got a snort out of Tim. And the two of them carried the conversation to different topics. I myself turned back to the food I had paused in eating to listen to the little drone's information. It had been quite informative. I started to sample the different items on my tray. And was quickly disappointed. It was decently nutrient-rich. But not by much more than the old nutrient slurry had been. And the taste was substandard at best. I asked what some of the items were. And found it hard to believe when Mikey and Tim listed food names also served at Maggie's Diner. Apparently the same item could come in multiple different qualities. Yeah, it's pretty bad. You should see what they try to pass off as meat. I swear the last time I poked a cafeteria steak, it triggered and tried to fly away, said Mikey. We talked about different subjects for a while when eventually the bell rang again. Lunch was now over. So which class do you have next then? Asked Mikey. Oh. I don't have a next class. Lunch dismissal. You know Bradley won't let you go early without your ID. Said Tim. Is he the semi-bald security guard? Yup, that's him. He's a real stickler for that stuff. You could have the office call your parents, I think. That wasn't an option. I don't have parents. Whatever those are. And informing the overseers that there was an unaccounted for drone didn't seem wise. Calling my parents isn't really an option. "Then it looks like you're stuck here, mate," said Mikey. "Come on. You can follow me. My next teacher, Mr. Kimber, never takes roll. And the last period is just going to be odd summer announcements anyways." Tim and Mikey split up partway outside the cafeteria. I followed Mikey, who led me up a few floors to a room filled with small table/chair combination furniture. Mikey led me to the back of the room and sat in one of the chairs. And I followed suit, sitting next to him. Drones slowly filled the desks. However, it did not seem like I was displacing anyone, as by the time the bell rang there were still a few empty desks. The bell rang and a large, fat drone with spectacles looked up from where it had been reading a screen. From its seat it addressed the class. "Bit of a change today. We will be going over the history of several important cities in relation to odd summer." It proceeded to turn on a large flat screen at the front of the classroom. On the screen was displayed a map which, when I compared it to the subway map, I realized was a fortress city, using a small device which was emitting a red beam of light. The drone swiveled its chair to face the screen and began to lecture for the next hour. And what an informative hour it was. The lesson from the teacher covered a brief mention of many cities, but it focused on 3 in particular. One was Area 52, a city based in a region known as Death Valley. The only reason it existed was because in the area the city was located there was so little wildlife that it became easier to deal with the resulting anomalies that odd summer brought. Another city was Hive City, what a redundant name, which was based in the breadbasket region. It was ruled over by a mutated animal, which had struck a deal with the United States government at the time, in exchange for maintaining the food supply to the rest of the United States. The mutant animal was protected instead of destroyed by the country. The final one was known as New York City. Unlike the other cities, it had been founded well before the first odd summer, so why was it called new? And the reason for its continued survival was that every odd summer it became enveloped in a thick fog that protected the city. Every time the event happened it merely enveloped itself in fog and at the end emerged unharmed, its citizens missing the memories of the intervening time. No one knew where the fog came from. And Mikey whispered to me that it was rumored the city itself had triggered during the first odd summer. Unfortunately, the city I wanted to know most about, Fortress City, was mentioned only briefly at the beginning. Founded on the California coast by the architect after the 5th odd summer. The only reason the teacher even mentioned it was because the architect had apparently negotiated the deal with Hive City's ruler. I guess Fortress City's history must have been covered in previous lectures. The bell eventually rang and I followed Mikey once more. This time to a very large room with metal bleachers to provide communal seating. We spotted Tim in the crowd and made our way over to where he was sitting. Again I noticed the same clustering I had witnessed in the cafeteria, with the students arranging themselves into groups. Besides the obvious segregation of the combat drones, I also noticed a secondary split. This one among drones that were referred to by he or him, and drones referred to by she or her. It wasn't a complete split, but it was enough to finally identify the factor that determined which was which. Surprisingly, it turned out to be a difference in their organic design code. I had finally gathered enough ambient samples to link the code pattern to the speech patterns. It didn't really seem to be an important difference, especially not when compared to some of the more heavily modified design codes I had come across. But I noted the distinction for future interactions. It would definitely help my disguise. The bell eventually rang and the students settled down, quieting, with some prompting, to let a drone on a raised platform speak. After introducing itself, it spoke about the fact that odd summer was starting. Several students around me whispered, "No duh," at this, and began to recite a list of safety tips and announcements. Don't go out after dark. Avoid anyone wearing a mask if you don't recognize them as a hero. If you must go somewhere, Do so in groups. Report anything suspicious to Central. And do not clog up the lines with frivolous reports or jokes. If you have physical modifications wear your armbands. Several combat drones grumbled about this. And regular drones stared at them. If you see anything abnormal, run first before reporting. If you do trigger, you must report it to Central as soon as safely possible. Yeah right, muttered Mikey in response. The locations of various shelters and their lockdown procedures. And how to get graduation and GPA information if your parents decided to withdraw you from school even earlier. I was somewhat confused by the items on the list. Several seemed completely useless. Why would darkness matter? Danger was constant despite the light level, and some were so obvious I wondered why it would even mention them. At the very least the shelter information was useful. And they displayed the pictures of 3 heroes that operate in E13. Magenta, Brick, and the superfast drone I had seen who went by the name Turbo. I made sure to memorize their appearances for later. I loved knowing who an enemy was in advance. The assembly slowly wound down. And they dismissed the students as the bell rang. Welp. That's another day down the drain. Feels so great knowing I've only got a few more of these. Said Mikey. I dunno. I think the schools are closing too early. Makes all the graduation and college stuff a hassle. Replied Tim. Hey. At least you aren't tofu here. Transferred in right before school ends. What luck is that? Are you also graduating this year, tofu, or do you have one more? I won't be coming back. I have a job I signed up for. Already nice. I usually get one during the summer too. Replied Mikey. We walked out of the school and I just aimlessly followed Mikey and Tim, letting them do most of the talking. We headed north from the school and kept to the 3rd level walkways until Tim eventually separated, heading to one of the higher levels. Mikey turned to me. So you live farther on? Or, yes. I live near Maggie's Sunrise Diner. On Mint Holly's Tea. Oh dang. That's quite a walk still. At least you won't have to do it more than a few times. We continued on until we finally reached Mikey's home. He lived in a 4th-floor apartment that had a convenient stairway to get to. As we approached I heard shouting from above. Normally I ignored this type of shouting since it was rather commonplace. However, Mikey looked up, frowned, and muttered a bit before turning to me. This is my stop. It was nice meeting you, Tofu. It was nice to meet you as well. Thank you again for the loan of your ID. No problem at all, man. See you tomorrow then. That depends. Maybe. I might need to go to my job. They making you start right away harsh. Anyways, later on, man. Later. I considered what I had learned today. It was definitely worth going back for more information. I had learned a lot in only a few hours. And the risk seemed surprisingly small. If I wasn't sent the signal to go to the orientation, I would definitely try to sneak in again. But geez, that food sucked. I kept exploring after I separated from Mikey. Mainly just testing if I could navigate from his house to Maggie's diner without needing to backtrack. Luckily, it seems like even in the most confusing areas the streets still follow a set pattern. The map that Mr. Kimber displayed helped me here. The city was almost perfectly round, with some streets forming straight lines from the center to the outer edges, and the rest of the streets forming concentric rings around the center. Using this information, I was easily able to navigate back to the tunnel entrance. I spent the rest of the afternoon hunting rats to test my new mask. I would most likely have to fight while wearing it, and I wanted to make sure it didn't impede me. I put the mask on and adjusted it to the size of my head. It fit quite snugly, even when I changed the shape of my head while wearing it. Once adjusted, I began checking my senses. Sight, Smell. Hearing. None of them were severely impacted, which surprised me. Outwardly it didn't really look like it was doing much. But in order to not hinder smelling and hearing while being form-fitting, it obviously had to be more complicated on the inside. I would like to open it up and see the inner workings. But Sandra had warned me to not try to modify it. Plus I was doubtful I understood enough to put it back together. My specialty was organic components, not inorganic ones. I made sure the helmet was properly in place and then began stalking the tunnels to look for rats. I started where I destroyed the nest last time and went from there. Quickly I found a fresh trail and followed it. Searching the tunnels for a while, I eventually found a new group of rats. This time it was a group of 6 big ones without any of the tiny ones. They were currently jumping out of a pipe in the ceiling. Most of them with small parcels in their mouths. Maybe this was a scavenging party. I charged around the corner using the same strategy as last time. As long as I didn't perform worse than last time, I would consider it a successful test of fighting with the mask on. Reaching the first one, I stabbed it in the back of the neck with my knife. The second one, I slashed its neck artery and gave it a good kick to daze it while it bled out. Surprisingly, the rest didn't run like last time and dropped their parcels to charge me, for all the good it did them. The third rat reached me and I stomped its head, using my traction claws to get a good grip and grind its face into the floor. When the fourth came close, I flung the third rat's corpse at it, knocking it away. From that point forth the fight became a dodging test. They would leap or charge and try to grapple me, while I dodged and used my height and weight advantage to rain blows on them. I had to say, while the drone form wasn't very combat specialized, being upright and tall was still a great advantage versus crawling foes. As long as I wasn't tripped, I could put most of my weight behind the blows. Eventually 4 rats laid dead or dying around me. The 2 survivors tried a last resort and one charged my feet while the other leaped. I kicked the one that went for my feet away, but the second landed on my upper torso and tried to bite at my face. It went for my eyes, but apparently it was too stupid to realize I was wearing a shell, and instead its teeth scrapped uselessly at the mask. I grabbed it around the middle and squeezed, increasing the pressure until its spine finally snapped. Dropping it to the floor, I readied myself for the last one. But I needn't have bothered. It was running far down the tunnel and ducked behind the next intersection as I watched. Well then, the mask definitely helped this time. But even if the rat hadn't attacked my face, the mask hadn't hindered my normal fighting methods at all. I'd say this was a successful test run of the mask. After testing the mask, I decided to hibernate for the night. Technically I could continue to scout the surrounding areas, but I was worried about what the drone at the school had said about being out after dark. There just had to be a real reason for why it would mention that. And if the rest of the drones were following that advice, I would need to follow it too, just to not stand out. And I suppose I needed to rest human.exe as well. I knew I could push it, but there was no real pressing need to. I scouted buildings for most of the morning, climbing up walkways and staircases to see how the area looked from up high. With one building I used the metal bar staircase to reach the roof. And as I looked out over the city, I saw buildings spreading out around me far into the distance. In the area around Maggie's they were only a few levels tall. But in the direction of Ashwoodesty, they created the illusion of a sloping hill as they gradually increased in size. Looking in the direction of Central, I could almost make out the tops of the megastructures that dominated that area. A massive panorama. I had to be wrong about the shape of this place. The ceiling wasn't a ceiling, but I didn't know what else it could be. I didn't have enough information to even make an informed guess. But I knew one place where I could find out more. I made my way back to Claremont High School. If I was timing it right, I should have about half an hour before lunch. And I used a higher walkway to scout the school without drawing the attention of the security guards. The main entrance to the school was a wide bridge that connected to the level 3 road walkway that made up the majority of Ashwood St. However, other smaller bridges extended to other walkways around the surrounding buildings. I spotted the security guard that had apprehended me last time. Getting caught by it again would probably not end as harmlessly as last time. It was a stickler for the rules if Tim and Mikey were to be believed. I decided to sneak in a little after the bell rang for lunch. Walking to one of the walkways that was one level above a side bridge. When a guard walked past on the bridge, I waited until it was a good distance away before I jumped down onto the bridge behind it. And soundlessly entered the single door that led inside. Inside was a corridor. And students were filtering out of the classrooms to go to the cafeteria. I quickly fell into place with the crowd. One or two young drones had seen me enter. But like I had noted yesterday, the student drones basically ignored one another unless they were part of the same social group. And I continued along unquestioned by them. The pattern from yesterday held. And the cafeteria was again a mass of young drones waiting in line for food. Curiously, I noticed that there were slightly fewer drones here today. Enough to be noticeable. I suppose that many parents had decided to withdraw them early after yesterday's announcements. While waiting in line, I spotted Mikey and Tim already at a table. Luckily between a quarter held by one of the rats from yesterday. And keeping a lookout for loose coins this morning. I had managed to scrape together the necessary $2. Today's lunch was supposedly fried veggies with a fruit cup and beans on the side. But I wasn't sure how much I believed them. I had seen fried veggies at Maggie's and I don't think they were supposed to leak. Tasted fine this time at least. I made my way over to Tim and Mikey. Strangely, neither of them was eating. And Mikey was sitting with his head in his hands. "Hello. May I sit with you again?" Tim looked up at me. "Oh. Hey Tofu. Yeah. Go for it, man. Thank you." I took a seat and started eating. But quickly I realized something was wrong with Mikey. He wasn't talking or eating. When yesterday he had kept the conversation going with Tim rather effortlessly. Tim also looked like something was bothering him. Ugh, it seemed more like he was worried about Mikey. I ate in silence for a bit. And eventually Tim tried to converse with Mikey. "Hey Mikey. We'll figure out something, man. No worries," said Tim. Even to me his reassurance sounded hesitant. And I decided to inquire. "Did something bad happen?" Tim looked over to me and was about to say something but hesitated. Looking first to Mikey. "My mother's scumbag boyfriend happened," replied Mikey. Boyfriend, scumbag, those were new terms I didn't recognize. Boy and friend I knew. And I had thought friend was a good term. I guess scumbag invalidates the positive connotation, at least friend implied the problem was a who and not a what. "What did they do?" I asked. Tim waited for Mikey. But when Mikey stayed silent he answered. "He stole the money that Mikey was saving for college." College. From what I had heard from the announcements yesterday and other students, it was the next level of training after high school. Students needed to pay to be trained at this level then, all 6,000 of it. Whispered Mikey. So quiet I almost couldn't hear him. 6,000. Estimated worth equals 600 cycles of operation minimum. Continuous. I reeled at Mikey's statement. $6,000. You could buy so much food with that. I hadn't even realized it was possible to get that much money. How did you get that much? Been working every summer since the last odd one. Tim answered. And now it's all down the drain. Said Mikey. Well, at least I now knew that a job paid well. Sandra had said that the minion job paid by every task done. But hadn't given a hard amount. Is there no way to get the money back? I asked. No. Scumbag already used it to pay off his dealer. My mom was fighting with him about it yesterday but. At this Mikey grit his teeth and clenched his fists before continuing. I'd almost consider it money well spent if it would just get him the hell out of my life. But he's like a leech. Sucking the life out of my mom. And now me too. It was then that the bell rang. And Mikey got up to go. Leaving his tray of food behind, he had been too distraught to eat. We'll think of something, Mikey. Promise. Thanks, Tim. Mikey replied. But he didn't seem very enthusiastic about it. As he walked away, I turned to Tim. How damaging is this for his plans? Tim looked at me and replied. It would have paid for the first semester at least. His grades are fine. But he didn't get any scholarships. Plus the nearest college is still an hour away even with the subway. He was hoping to rent and maybe work part-time. Now though. Anyways, I'll see you later, Tofu. I need to get to class. Tim walked away with his shoulders down. I pondered the situation as I ate the rest of Mikey's lunch. Technically this whole thing wasn't my problem. My main concern was securing steady nutrition and resources without compromising my disguise. But that didn't really feel right to me. I had not been anyone important to Mikey. And yet he had still fed me for free, 2 times now. If possible, I'd like to maintain valuable drones like that. Who knows where else I would find someone willing to feed me for free. Mikey had said that the money was probably not recoverable. But he also said he would settle for getting rid of the scumbag boyfriend. Maybe I could help with that. I spent the next 2 periods in Mr. Kimber's class, listening to a fascinating lecture on post-odd summer supply routes. I was somewhat distracted by Mikey's situation, however. Rather than slowly take notes like he had yesterday. Today he just stared at his desk. Disregarding knowledge and not eating. Definitely distraught. When the bell rang, I went to the restroom. And changed my face in the stall to attend Mr. Kimber's class again. While listening to the supply route lecture a second time, repeated verbatim. Obviously Mr. Kimber is a practiced professional. I calculated the risk of getting rid of the scumbag boyfriend. It was a bit more risky than the 2 ambushers. Those had most likely been working only with each other. But the scumbag boyfriend was apparently subservient to this dealer. And its absence might be missed. Plus, I didn't know how much it would take for cops or superheroes to get involved. As a backup plan, maybe it would be possible for Mikey to get the money from an alternate source. Gathering coins off the floor had worked for me so far. Although I wasn't sure if Mikey could gather as efficiently as I could. It depended on how long odd summer lasted. And on how long it took before the colleges started to function afterwards. I'd think of something. For now I planned to follow Mikey home again. This time I would take note of the exact residence and come back while Mikey was in school to get rid of the leech. I just needed to make sure I killed the scumbag boyfriend and not the mom. But I doubted that would be too hard to figure out. The bell rang and I hurried to the restroom stall to change my face back. I needed to catch up to Mikey and Tim before they left. I reached the entrance bridge before they did and greeted them. Tim was a bit surprised I had stayed past lunch again. But I made up an excuse about having lost my ID. And it not being worth the hassle of replacing since school was almost over anyways. On the way home, Tim did his best to try and come up with a solution. Mikey tried to go along with it. But it was obvious he didn't really believe the offered suggestions would work. When Tim left to follow his own route home, his brow was still furrowed with trying to come up with a solution. Mikey and I walked along in silence after that. Blocks passed by while Mikey just walked along staring at the floor. As we reached the stairs that led up to his place, Mikey hesitantly turned to me. Hey Tofu. Do you think that maybe your job has any more openings? I feel bad asking right after meeting you. But I I don't know what else to do. I had considered that option. But being a minion had struck me as rather dangerous for a normal drone. Plus I wasn't sure if I wanted Mikey to know what I was doing. I'm not sure if they have spots open. And I should warn you, the job is kinda risky. Want me to ask if they are hiring more, or really? Yes. Yes, please. I'll do anything, dude. I really need to make money right now. And people almost never hire during odd summer. Hey there, Squirt. How wash school? Said a garbled voice. Mikey's face instantly went from smiling back to the frown from earlier. With added signs of anger detectable as well. Clenching his fists and gritting his teeth, he turned to the approaching drone that had spoken. It was an older drone wearing long leg covers and a brown jacket on its torso. It seemed to be wavering as it walked. And it approached the two of us slowly, seeming to put extra thought into each step. In one of its hands it held a brown paper bag with a glass bottle inside. Estimated threat, negligible. When it reached us it spoke again. You tykes learn anything new today, and it placed a hand on Mikey's head to ruffle his hair. Mikey immediately smacked the hand away. Ah. Don't be that way, Squirt. You still mad about yesterday? I told ya. I'll pay you back. Here. I even had a good day today. At this the drone reached into a pocket and pulled out a single crumpled paper rectangle. The symbol, 20, imprinted on it. He offered it to Mikey. But Mikey didn't move. Just stared at the ground with his fists clenched. Eventually the drone gave up and just tossed the paper at Mikey's torso. Geez, Squirt. You're such a sour poosh. You won't make any French that way, you know. Said the drone. Then it turned to walk away. Mikey didn't make a move. So I bent and grabbed the crumpled paper, flattening it out as I did so. Yep. The symbols on the paper represented just $20. Not 2,000 or even 200. Just 20. Not even close to the 6,000 it owed Mikey. Mikey was red with anger. His limbs quivering. I was honestly surprised he hadn't attacked the drone yet. Was the risk of repercussion from attacking the older drone just too high for a young drone to act oh well? I owed Mikey for the lunches anyway. Just needed to confirm with him. Hey Mikey. I'm pretty sure it is. But just to make sure I don't have it wrong. This is the scumbag boyfriend you were talking about, right? Mikey stirred at my words. His eyes rising to meet mine with confusion. What the hell, Duché? Asked the drone as it whirled back at us. Not quite as unsteady as it was at first glance. Estimated threat, minimum. I'm asking if you're the scumbag boyfriend who stole money from Mikey. I wouldn't want to get it wrong. Mikey was staring at me in disbelief. Eyes wide. And the older drone's face was quickly becoming angry and red. Much like Mikey's had been. But this drone didn't have Mikey's patience. And it swung at me with the bottle. I suppose that was as good a confirmation as any. Its limb moved in a wide arc. While it may have had some force behind it, it was still a really clumsy swing. And I caught it with my right hand. It barely even made my arm budge. It blinked at me stupidly. Obviously it hadn't expected that to happen. And I took advantage of its confusion to grab its throat in my other hand and squeeze. It dropped the bottle in its flailing. And with both hands tried to claw at my arm to dislodge it. I used my now free right hand to pull out my knife, which caused the drone to scrabble harder. TT Tofu. What in the world are you doing? Said Mikey. Wasn't it obvious? Well, you said you would be fine with the lost money if he would at least disappear. I'm doing that. Dude. I didn't mean. You can't just stab a person in broad daylight. Mikey exclaimed. Ah. Now I understood. I scanned the area. We were the only drones around right now. But Mikey had a point. The place was rather open. And there might be unseen witnesses. I wasn't in any hurry this time around. So it was better to take my time and take care of all the details. I started to drag the scumbag boyfriend to the dark alley next to Mikey's building. It was the kind that had a space to let you see to the floors below. With a shoulder-high fence to keep drones from falling. I'd been eating really well the past few days. Between the rats and drone food. So at this point I was quite a bit denser than my size would suggest. With the extra muscle and weight behind my movements I easily pulled the drone into the alley. Mikey a few steps behind me. The drone I was holding redoubled its efforts to get away and started to make strange sounds. Hey! Tofu! Look! I appreciate it, man. Really. But the seas will be all over you if you do this. Like. It's a really bad idea and. Mikey trailed off and stared at the drone. I followed his gaze and found that the drone had given up trying to pry me free. Instead it was holding out something it had pulled from a pocket. A rolled-up bundle of paper. A bundle of money bills. Ah. Seems it hadn't used the money after Ali let go of its throat and let it fall to the ground. It gasped and wheezed as its face slowly regained its normal color. It had been taking on an interesting bluish tint. Mikey walked over and grabbed the money bundle. Quickly checking through it. 3,000. He said at last. You still had 3,000. Suddenly he lashed out with a foot. Kicking the drone in the side. Were we killing it or not? Did you even have a debt? Or were you just stealing my money? You lazy. Kick, good for nothing, kick, drunk. Junkie, kick, kick. Wow. I didn't know drones could get this angry. Even if it wasn't very efficient. The sheer rage was intimidating. Mikey finally stopped kicking him and backed away. Heaving for breath as he collected himself. I waited until he seemed calm again before I spoke. So. What do you want to do with him? Mikey gulped a little more air and responded. I just want him out of my life. Understood. I bent over the drone and picked him up by the front of his shirt cover before I started to drag him over to the fence. There was a hole in the metal mesh where it only rose to the height of my waist. The drone immediately started to protest. Wait. Wait. Don't do this. Squire, I mean. Michael, don't let him do this. Please. I can pay you back. Honest, I can. I looked out over the barrier to the layers below and then hauled him up. Leaning him out over the drop. It kept begging. Water beginning to leak from its eyes. Please. I can. 6,000. What? $6,000. Pay it back or the next time I see you I take the cost from your hide. S6 But I didn't use. I gave him a shake and he shut up. Whimpering. You have until the end of odd summer. Then I dropped him. Right onto the lid of a giant trash receptacle one level down. I'd tested the plastic the lids were made of during my previous explorations. It was flexible enough to let him live from the fall. Probably. I didn't really care. But Mikey seemed to for some reason. I turned back to Mikey who was staring at the money in his hands. Not saying a word. I spoke up. Is it enough for college? Not really. It was almost enough before. But now. Businesses buckle down during odd summer. Almost nobody hires. And if they do they won't pay enough. Well. I know someone who is. We entered through the front door. Still open despite how late in the day it had gotten. We approached the scaled drone sitting at the single piece of furniture in the room. It looked up after an almost solid minute of tapping at its phone and sighed in irritation when it saw us. TCH. God damn it all. Sandra. They're multiplying. Mikey got signed up to be a minion without any problems. Even though he was hesitant at first. He had tried to explain to me how the superheroes were the good guys and the supervillains were the bad guys. But I hadn't really understood the reasoning. I had thought maybe that meant the superheroes won engagements more often. But even Mikey admitted that it was probably more like half and half. If not in the villain's favor. I think it was that fact that made him finally follow me to the recruiting office on Ashwood St. That and the money. Sandra assured the both of us that as long as a job was completed to satisfaction, the reward was well worth the effort. Once she heard about Mikey's situation, she estimated that he could easily make up the money by the end of the summer with a few big jobs. Or just a bunch of little ones. Technically Hellion also paid a living wage, but that was only for permanent employees and we had to get past the trial phase before that was on the table. Either way. She assured Mikey that he could hench for the summer and leave afterwards, no questions asked if that was what he wanted. Once we were done, we left for Mikey's home again. Mikey with his new black face mask in his possession. Unlike mine, which protected the entire head. His mask only covered the upper portion of his face. And was just for protecting his identity. A concept that I found humorous. Once I understood it. Apparently the masks were more a form of social protection than physical. Both for villains and heroes. It surprised me to know that all of them were doing the exact same thing I was. Albeit for a slightly different reason. I was starting to understand what Jasper meant by guarding our secrets more than our lives. Mikey also warned me not to tell Tim about the henching job. Apparently Tim was a superhero fanboy and dreamed about getting a power so he could become a superhero. I found that very strange. Especially since Tim was always quoting odds and statistics. He should understand that being a hero was the more dangerous option. The next few days settled into a steady rhythm. Wake up and explore the city in the morning. Go to the school for lunch and Mr. Kimber's informative lectures. In the afternoon, hang out with Mikey and Tim. And finally hunt rats until it was time to hibernate for the night. It was relatively peaceful. And I learned a lot of new things, the ordering of the days being among them. But eventually things came to an end when Friday rolled around. I ate lunch with Mikey and Tim in the cafeteria. Thanked Mr. Kimber for his teachings after 6th period. And walked home with Mikey and Tim once school let out. I didn't go rat hunting this time. Instead doing a general systems check. I was currently about a little over twice as dense as a normal drone my size. I had traction claws hidden in my shoes. And my arm bones and muscles were modified to allow for rapid extension. Both for surprise attacks and for mobility. My core was hidden in a protective shell made from scraps of metal. I still had my knife. Kept sharp with micro-unit repairs. I had various bits of loose change hidden in different spots. And finally my mask. Mass, 135% norm. Energy reserves, 10 cycles continuous. Yup. I was ready for tomorrow. I woke up a little before dawn. The mask had beeped, which had triggered my awakening. And I checked the display. 5:14 Ashwood St. 9 a.m. Bring mask. Wear something to move in. I left the tunnel. And headed towards Ashwood St. Technically I still had time. But I also didn't have anything else to do. I hadn't gathered enough money to get breakfast at Maggie's and I didn't want to get caught up in rat hunting right now. The areas near Ashwood St. became active quickly as the sun rose. I wandered around the store windows looking inside them. Figuring out that they weren't all food dispensaries had been a big disappointment the first time I came here. The worst was when a place selling candles had smelled delicious, but hadn't had anything of nutritional value when I went in to check. By my count it was 8:30. And I decided to just head for the designated location. Being a bit early was better than a bit late. And the message had only said 9 a.m. 514, Ashwood Street. Turned out to be a clothing store. It was right next to 512 as well. Not the most subtle considering this was supposed to be a secret location. I entered the store and looked around. All of the coverings on display were large. Padded jackets meant for cold weather. Odd. There are changing rooms in the back if you want to try something on, said a bored-looking drone behind the counter. Then it went back to reading its magazine. My mask was currently in a torso pouch. And I checked the message displayed on it again. Yup. 514, Ashwood Street. This was the correct location. Maybe the orientation just hadn't started yet. He browsed the store for a while. It really did just sell jackets. I was beginning to worry when another drone walked in. This one wore blue leg coverings and had a red shirt on its torso. There are changing rooms in the back if you want to try something on, said the drone behind the counter, in the exact same tone it had used before. The new drone ignored it completely and headed straight for the changing rooms. It entered one, without bringing a jacket to try, and then stayed there. And stayed. And stayed even longer. It never came back out. Very odd. Something was suspicious with these changing rooms. I tried to ask the drone by the counter if the orientation was taking place here. But it just repeated the same phrase again. Well, this was getting pretty obvious. I entered one of the changing rooms in the back. And the moment I closed the door behind me, the mask beeped with a new message. Put on the mask. I did. And when it was in place, it beeped again before the back of the changing room opened up, revealing a corridor into the darkness. Aha! It had been some kind of puzzle test. I entered the corridor and the door closed behind me. There were dim guiding lights along the floor. And they led to something I recognized. It was one of those metal moving rooms that transported drones from one layer to the next. This one only had one button next to it. And I pressed it. The doors opened immediately. I entered the small room and found there were no buttons on the inside. Only a metal bar to hold onto along the sides. And a single red lever next to the door labeled, Emergency Stop. Luckily, I recognized the symbols thanks to my time at the school. And I knew enough not to pull it. I'd had my fill of fire alarms already. The doors closed on their own and I was on my way. Unlike the room back at the test chamber, that went up and down. This room went in multiple directions. During transit I detected the room changing directions more than once. If my guess was correct, I was somewhere in the underground tunnel layer by this point. Jasper was right about supervillains and underground layers, it seems. The room finally came to a stop and opened into a brightly lit corridor, lined with lots of frames for multiple metal moving rooms. Above each was the location where that moving room came from. Seems like you could get to almost anywhere on Ashwood Street using this place. I followed the corridor until it exited into a large empty room. Tables and chairs were scattered around and there was a small box-like device on a table in the corner, along with a coffee maker. Several other doors and corridors were spaced out along the walls, making me think of the test chambers again. A multitude of masked drones were milling about the room. Some talked in small groups. However, most of them seemed to be keeping to themselves. Almost all of them were wearing the black face masks. And I only spotted 3 other drones wearing the full cover shells. One was the drone with the red shirt from earlier. Another was a bit smaller than me and wore red metal hand coverings. And the last was an obvious combat model drone. Standing at about 8 feet high with its skin covered completely in thick green scales. These three stood alone in their own little pockets of space. The last drone in the room was somewhat different than the others. This one wore a red mask that was physically identical to the white masks except for the color and two stubby horns that poked out from the forehead. Its body coverings were different as well. Made of a black, flexible material that appeared armored and covered it from its neck to its feet. The only other items it possessed were a pair of projectile weapons it kept in holsters under its shoulders. The red mask drone was talking to three other drones with black face masks. One of which was the Lily drone from the recruiting office. It was unmistakable with its scales and claws. Nobody in the room gave instructions. So I just found an empty seat and sat down to wait. I did see Mikey in the crowd, standing awkwardly near some of the other drones that appeared to be younger. Most of them appeared nervous. Mikey didn't recognize me with the white mask on. And I realized I hadn't told him I signed up as a powered minion. I would tell him later. We waited until about 9:30 before the red mask drone cleared its throat and addressed the room. All right. Looks like anyone who's coming is here. Anyone showing up later than this is fired anyways. Come closer and grab a seat if you want. My name's Imp. And I work for Hellion. Welcome to orientation. We've got some announcements to make before we proceed with the physical portion of the job interview. And before you ask. Yes, this is still part of the interview. Most of the drones shuffled and took seats. A few choosing to stand around the edges of the room. First of all, just to make sure no one is still confused. This is a henching job for the supervillain known as Hellion. It involves doing criminal activities which may or may not result in injury, incarceration, or death. If any of these sound bad to you, feel free to leave. Just do me a favor and leave your mask in the changing room on your way out. This goes for all of you at any time during this orientation. If you don't want to be here, we don't want you here. Oh. And don't bother trying to inform police or heroes about this meeting. Nothing we do at this orientation is illegal, and I can guarantee they probably already know about it anyways. Surprisingly, after this announcement, quite a few of the drones did in fact leave. Mostly the young, nervous-looking ones. But a few of the older drones left as well. One was even a combat model. I noted that Mikey chose to stay. Speaking of heroes, there are some things you should know. We hold these orientations every Saturday, and sometimes the heroes do like to crash the party. If they do, calmly head for any of the exits marked in green. Even if they catch you, we aren't doing anything illegal. The other lieutenants and I will have to jam. But you can just say you were coerced into being here. One of our lawyers will contact you either way. Again, a few drones left at this. Next. If you actually aren't supposed to be here. Say you're a hero who snuck in. Or a rival gang spy. Know that we almost always find out. We aren't a bunch of rookies here. Hellion's henchman has been around for over a decade. And you don't last that long if a single mole would bring you down. This goes double if you're just some dumb punk who thought they'd sneak in to topple us from inside. Or turn us into the police and heroes later. If you aren't working directly for a legal agency, any crimes you commit while working for us are real crimes, and you will most likely be prosecuted for them. Without our lawyers to help you. If any of this applies to you, you don't have to rush out right this second. Just sneak out sometime today, or just don't come back. None of the drones left this time. But I noted that a few looked like they wanted to. Now about your masks. Make sure you keep them on while on the job and use your call signs. We regulars tend to be a bit loosey-goosey with our identities since we have great lawyers, and the capes tend to know who we are already anyway. But if you're only with us temporarily, you'll want to keep your identity as secret as possible. Especially if you plan to work for Central later on. We've had some people come through who went on to have really respectable jobs. Even a hero or two who needed the money bad enough. I'll mention that if any of you guys in the helmets plan to do hero work later, I recommend you switch to a face mask if your power is too recognizable. That was an interesting bit of information. I was surprised by how casually Imp treated the possibility of encountering someone here as an enemy later. And how he didn't seem to hold any anger for the possible spies and enemies who might show up. Maybe this was those unspoken rules at play. Everything seemed to be almost friendly the way Imp spoke about it. But I had seen the Merc blow up a bus full of civilians. And the Guardian risk its life to save me. I doubted everything was quite as civil as Imp made it out to be. Imp continued to the next part of the orientation. Okay, everyone. I think that's mostly everything. If I haven't scared you off yet. Next is the physical part of the orientation. This is meant to both give us an idea of what you can do and to give you an idea of what being a minion takes. If you would all follow me, please. Imp left through a large double door in the side of the room. Followed by Lily and the other masked drones he had been talking to earlier. The crowd of potential minions got up to shuffle through after him. The double door led into a corridor. At the end of which was another set of doors that led into a massive empty room. The walls, ceiling, and floor were all made out of the same stone material they used back in the test chambers. Lighting was provided by large lit panels in the ceiling. And white lines were inscribed in concentric ovals on the floor. Imp waited for the crowd of drones to finish entering before addressing them again. All right. There aren't a lot of requirements to be a minion. You do what I and the other lieutenants say. The job gets done. You go home paid. But every now and then cops and capes will show up to stop the party, and that's when you have to make a choice. Do you surrender or do you run for it? For now, start running laps about the room. Seemed simple enough. I started running in the direction he indicated and several drones followed me. Curiously, most of the drones looked confused and hadn't started running. Did they really not understand what they had to do? Only a couple of the drones had followed after me. And only the drone with the white mask and red hand coverings had been as quick to follow the order. Bang! Instantly I swiveled my head in the direction of the sound and took a combat stance. Imp had taken one of his weapons and fired it at the ceiling. Once I observed he didn't intend any hostile actions, I went back to running. Although I kept my senses trained on him. That wasn't a suggestion, rookies. Either get running or leave. The door is right behind you. Yelled Imp to the room. Most of the drones started running. But a few left out the door. The thing about being a minion is that it's actually pretty easy work. The supervillains you work for will be doing all the hard parts. Making the plan. Getting the essential components for whatever machinery they need. Fighting the heroes. All that good jazz. Most of what you'll be doing is moving boxes around. Standing guard. Maybe driving a car. And running. Lots and lots of running. See, the thing is, while you're wearing that mask, you are an anonymous person. No one cares about who you are. Only what you're doing and who you're working for. In the eyes of the law, you are an accessory to the supervillain's crime. A tool in the same way a death ray or a robot is. Anything you do is their fault. They made the plan. They did the crime. And when the police ask why you were working for them, you just plead that they forced you. Not like you could stand up to a supervillain. They threatened you. Your job. Your family. And boom. Instant excuse. Now. That all sounds pretty good on paper. Just surrender and theoretically the law can't touch you. But that's not always the way things go in real life. What if a rival gang makes a surprise attack on the warehouse you're guarding? What if some random Joe Schmo with powers decides to take the bank robbery personally, or a mutant animal thinks you look like a snack? What if some Overactive hero throws a bus at the villain. Why? In all of the above cases you run like a bat out of hell, ladies and gentlemen. You can't get paid if you're dead. For the next hour we kept running around the room. Imp sometimes commenting with a random fact or observation about the job. Most of the drones couldn't run for the full hour. I was surprised when some couldn't run even 10 minutes. But stopping didn't mean they were sent home. Instead they were instructed to get their breath back and then keep going. I managed to gather quite a bit of data on average drone physical abilities. The majority seemed unable to run past the 15-minute mark. But a few outliers were able to keep the pace set by those in front. Mostly the combat models among the black masks. Finally Imp stopped the runners, warning them to walk a cool-down lap. Alright everyone. Good job persevering. Now that I've got you good and tired out, it's time to show you the next part of the workout. Several groans rose up from the crowd upon hearing that. I was almost a bit disturbed by how bad most of them seemed at physical activity. Not what I had expected from organisms that ate such nutrient-dense food. Okay. Everyone in the black masks, please follow Viper to the small gym. At this he gestured to the drone I knew as Lily. And you guys in the white masks, follow me. The four of us in the white masks stepped forward and followed Imp into a side room that was almost as large as the room we were just in. But this one contained large devices everywhere. So. I know some of you. Ifrit. Olsen. Nice to have you back with us, by the way, Olsen. He nodded to the small one with red metal hand covers and then the one with the red shirt. Olsen nodded back at him. Good to be back, Imp. Replied the red shirt drone. And for you new guys, what's your call signs? Asked Imp. You can call me Gregor. Replied the green scaled drone. My name is Tofu. I replied. Nice to meet you both. Now. As you might imagine, the physical side of the job is a bit more intense for you guys in the white masks. What we're gonna do is some physical tests to see what your limits are. Like you heard in the interview process, you don't have to state how your power works. But I need to know a little about your capabilities if we're gonna work together in the field. Do you mind giving me a brief rundown? That's fine with me. Replied Gregor. I've got enhanced strength and stamina. I've blocked knives and stuff with my scales. Most stuff bounces off. But I can't stop high caliber bullets. Then Imp turned to me. Luckily, I had been talking to Tim a lot about superpowers. And I had planned ahead of time for what I would reveal of my abilities. I've got regeneration and a few physical modifications. A bullet won't kill me unless it hits a bad spot. According to Tim, regeneration was a rather common power. And as I had seen everywhere, physical modifications were quite abundant. Good to know. We'll be getting all of you suits eventually to help with the bullet problem. Said Imp. Theoretically you shouldn't need them since you will be doing minion work just like everyone else. But the honest truth is you're gonna have some stuff aimed your way. Now. To tell you a little about myself. As said before, my name is Imp. I've worked for Hellion about 15 years now. And my power is teleportation of myself and small objects. Suddenly his projectile weapons were out of his holsters and in his hands. They hadn't moved. They just appeared there as if they had been there the whole time. Estimated threat, very high. If he could move objects around instantly like that, fighting him could be tricky. Who knows what weapon could appear in his hands? And he said he can move like that himself now then. Said Imp. Time for the fun part. We spent the next hour using the different machines in the room to test for strength, reflexes, and stamina. I tried to intentionally lower my results. No reason to reveal my limits to them. But I did keep myself in line with the other two modified drones. Gregor was of course obviously modified. But it turned out Ifrit was as well. Some kind of internal variant if my guess was correct. as she had extra strength and her reflexes were quite fast. Her size and movements were in line with my own, so I attempted to model my results mostly after hers. The strangest one was Olsen, who as far as I could tell was a completely normal drone. Perhaps he had one of the anomalous powers then. I really wanted to figure out how to get one of those. But so far drones had been rather secretive on the subject, never saying the actual mechanism behind it and instead referring to it as trigger or awakening or quirked, or any number of other things. As far as I could tell, all of the terms meant the same thing: you now had superpowers. We were finishing up a weightlifting test and a drone wearing a black mask came in through the door. This was one of the ones that had been talking to Imp and Lily, or perhaps I should say Viper, while she's masked, back in the room with tables and chairs. Imp turned to it and said, "Hey Adder. You guys finished up already with the others?" "Almost. Viper is still pounding the stuffing out of the last few. And Rattleback is handing out the band-aids and stuff. You about ready for me in here?" "Yeah, I think so." Then he turned to us. "Let me introduce you to Adder, folks. She, Viper, and Rattleback are our primary combat trainers for the minions. If you need hand-to-hand combat training, you come to Adder here." "Pleased to meet you all," replied Adder. After introductions, Imp led the way to a section of padded floor in one corner of the room. "So then," said Imp, "let's see what you guys got." I hit the floor with an audible thump. Again. What was going on? Attack pattern calculation failed. Once Imp led us to the section of padded floor. He had explained that we would be doing something called barehanded combat training. At first I was worried that this would be like the combat tests the white coats used to make me do. But Imp explained that the goal was simply to knock your opponent down to the ground, and not to kill them like I was used to. Ifrit was the first to challenge Adder, and I thought she did relatively well. Their movements were odd, and I attributed the strange movements to them basing their combat patterns on not trying to harm each other. They exchanged a few blows before Adder gained the upper hand and knocked Ifrit to the floor. From what I could tell, Adder focused on grabbing Ifrit's coverings and using them to redirect her motion, while Ifrit tried to do similar. Neither attempted to use powers or a weapon. It seemed simple enough. Ifrit then stood up and, for some reason, bent her torso in Adder's direction, which Adder then reciprocated. I couldn't figure out what the purpose of the gesture was. "Okay. How about you next, Tofu?" said Imp. I stepped forward onto the mat and took an offensive position until Imp announced the start. When he did, I moved forward and tried a few jabs to see what Adder would do. Then the next thing I knew, I was on the floor. Error: calculating attack pattern failed. Estimated threat, very high. That was odd. From the sensory stimuli I recorded, I knew that Adder had grabbed my arm after the third jab. I had tried to shift my weight to take advantage, and then I was suddenly staring at the ceiling. "Nice try, Tofu. Gregor, you're up next," said Imp. I got up and went to stand next to the other drones while trying to figure out what just happened. Gregor approached next, and I resolved to closely analyze their fight to see if I could identify the attack pattern that Adder was using. The fight started and Gregor charged forward, obviously intending to use his weight and size to barrel down his smaller opponent. Adder avoided Gregor by dodging low to the ground, out of reach of his hands, and took advantage of his charge to trip one of his feet. At first I didn't think her lower mass would be enough to halt his momentum. But instead of just throwing her body against his foot, she had grabbed his leg in some kind of limb lock, and Gregor fell to the floor as his leg failed to obey him. From the sounds Gregor made, it was also pretty painful. I kept forgetting about using pain. It didn't debilitate me. And some other organisms like the anomalous yellowfur just ignored it. So it seemed a risky tactic to employ. After that it was Olsen's turn. Despite his protests. "Come on, Olsen. I promise I'll go easy on you," said Adder while flashing a smile. "I felt your easy last time too. And I've still got the bruises to prove it," he replied. Adder laughed at that. And despite his denial of being able to fight her, Olsen actually did the best of any of us. Lasting almost a full minute before he fell. Ifrit went again and did a little better this time. But fell quickly enough. Then it was my turn again. Defensive protocol. I took a defensive position rather than an offensive one this time. I was going to treat this like a brown fur fight. If a single mistake got me thrown to the ground, then it was a lot like how a brown fur could critically injure me in a single blow. I didn't move when the fight started. Instead, allowing her to come to me. She raised her brows in surprise at this. But obliged me in being the attacker this time. I lasted a little longer by not allowing her to get an easy hold on me. But eventually the fact that I was guarding too zealously allowed her to corner me and slip an arm past my guard. I tried to retaliate by counter-grabbing. But the moment I did, I was on the floor again. "Much better that time, Tofu," said Adder. From that point forward we took turns trying to knock Adder over. But by the end of the hour none of us had succeeded. I improved for sure. But I just couldn't keep up with Adder's attack patterns. I had found that she didn't stick to one overall protocol and instead just switched to match her opponent. I had always thought I was pretty good at switching my patterns to match the situation. But the sheer amount of patterns she displayed put my repertoire to shame. Plus, I think she used some kind of power. Because in a few of our fights she seemed to disappear. Once we were done, Adder began to tell each of us how to improve, starting with Ifrit. Apparently Ifrit and Adder knew each other. And outside of the job, Adder acted as Ifrit's martial arts teacher. Then she turned to me. "So Tofu, you're pretty rough, but you've got good instincts. You're self-taught, right?" "Yes. How could you tell? A couple small details. But they show that you're more used to a straight street brawl. Quick engagements. Go for the throat. Don't take risks unless you have to. That kind of stuff. Basically you fight like a caged animal. Against any average brawler it will work just fine. But if you fight someone with real training, especially capes, they will probably know how to handle it. No worries though. You've got the talent. I'll whip you into shape," she said with a wink. I hoped that wasn't literal. Adder gave some advice to Gregor and then went over what Olsen had been doing for training while he was away. Apparently Olsen had worked on and off for Hellion since last odd summer. But had to stop a year ago due to personal issues. Adder finished giving us her analysis before Imp spoke up. "Well folks, that was a good workout. How about we head to the break room and get some grub?" We followed him back to the room with tables and chairs. Inside were some of the masked drones that had gone with Adder and Viper. They looked a bit scuffed up. Scraps and small sticky band-aids applied to them in some places. Notably, of the 25 or so that had gone with Viper and Adder, only about 10 were still here. Including Mikey. But far more importantly, most of them had a plate of food in front of them. I checked for the source. And on top of a very large, long table placed against the back of the room I saw the food. It was beautiful. I needed to borrow the drone word for it. Because this was not a concept I had ever really dealt with before. Plentiful. Nutritious. Amazing. Astounding. Confusing. Those were the closest I had come before now. But now I understood. There were literal piles of food on the table. I noted burgers and sandwiches like the ones at Maggie's. But there were lots of foods that I had no name for. Imp walked forward and addressed the room. Well, that does it for the orientation. Feel free to grab what you want and chow down. Think of it as an apology for throwing you into a hard workout with the trainers on your first day. We tend to reserve spreads like this for after we do the big jobs, so make sure you try out everything while you can. I'll be getting in touch tomorrow or the day after with your first job. So keep your eyes on your masks. If for some reason you absolutely can't get to a job at the time we list, press the cancel notification button. Do not abuse that option. We need it to plan how many people are coming. If you have a day job you think is going to get in the way, let Sandra know at the office so she can send us a schedule we can work around. Other than that, you're done for the day. Congrats on surviving your first day as a minion. There were a few sounds of acknowledgement from the crowd and Imp left through a side room. I waited long enough for Adder to show me how to open the white mask to allow for eating before I made a direct path to the food. So many options. I piled a plate as high as I could get it. There were veggies wrapped in these bread things. And bowls for some kind of thick liquid. And meat. I didn't know that drones actually ate meat. The stuff on the table had been cooked in much the same way as the burgers. And I didn't know what organism it came from. Yup. It wouldn't all fit. So I made a second plate and placed a bowl of the liquid on top of the second food pile. I wouldn't be able to carry any more in a single trip without shifting. And I took one plate in each hand before I headed to the seating area. Scanning the room, I saw that Mikey's table was empty, so I decided to sit with him. I still needed to tell him I was wearing a white mask anyways. I made my way over to Mikey's table before plopping down my food. Hello, Mikey. Amazing food they have here, right? Much better than the cafeteria food. Mikey was somewhat unfortunate, as at that moment he started to cough and choke before he could greet me back. Probably some food in his windpipe. A terrible design flaw that most drones shared. Poor guy. Cough cough, T-tofu that you? Yes. Are you alright? I cough. Yeah, I'm fine. What in the world are you doing with a white mask? You had powers, yes. Is that so surprising? You witnessed me toss the scumbag. Well, I thought you just had a stronger than normal Benedictsi reaction, I guess. I didn't really have time to think about it. Ha. This joke I understood. Needing time to think. He had nearly a whole week to do so. I would have to remember to laugh when drones made jokes. Sometimes they behaved oddly when you didn't react with laughter. So Tofu. You have like a real superpower then. I had planned on telling anyone who asked that I had mutavis, as that was what I most heard associated with physical alterations. The superpower label seemed to be reserved for the physics-defying powers. No. It's not a real power. I answered. Oh. So it was Benedictsi. Is it mutavis then? Mikey asked hesitantly. It's rude to ask, kid. Came a deep voice with a slight hiss I recognized as Gregor's. I turned to see the hulking green figure of Gregor. He had also smartly piled 2 plates of food. Seems he favored the cooked meat items. Mind if I sit here? Asked Gregor. Mostly to me. No. Go ahead. I answered back. He placed his plates down with a thunk at an empty spot. Then sat down in the chair with an even bigger thump. A suddenly pale-faced Mikey responded. I am sorry. I didn't mean any offense. Gregor's expression softened a bit before he answered. He had taken his mask off to eat. None taken. Just know it's not nice to ask that casually. And around seas it can be rather unwise to ask at all. Oh. I see. Said Mikey. Then he turned to me. Sorry, Tofu. No worries. I muffled past a mouthful of food. We talked a bit, but mostly I concentrated on eating. It was really good. Especially the cooked meat. I might have overdone it a bit though. As Mikey commented on how much I was eating, Dang dude. Where are you putting it all? Exclaimed Mikey. Even Gregor seemed impressed. I digest quickly. Like a high metabolism, yes. That. Note to self, find out what metabolism means. Not much else happened besides Rattleback coming by and introducing himself to me and Gregor. Apparently he was the quartermaster for equipment. And asked if I had any special requirements for using my abilities. I mentioned I had higher than normal metabolism, and that I would need something to help against bullets. He replied that they would try to get me a suit soon. And he would look into getting some speedster MREs. Whatever those were. Once he left, Mikey announced he was going back for seconds, and was quite surprised when I went with him for more. No telling when the next meal would come around. And this was the best tasting I had ever eaten. I was very glad I had taken Jasper's advice in getting a job. Especially one that let me claim my abilities were of power. I eventually had to call it quits on getting more food. Even the large drone Gregor had begun to look worried over how much I was eating. Mikey and I left to the elevators, and instead of heading my separate way, I went with Mikey to hang out, as he put it. The elevator let us out in a gym locker room. And after Mikey called Tim on his phone, the three of us hung out for the next few hours. It was an interesting experience. Especially when they took me to an arcade. A type of reflex/puzzle testing chamber that focused on using screens to make hypothetical simulations. There wasn't any physical danger. So I found it rather relaxing. Tim was quite happy when we told him that Mikey had gotten a job at the same place where I worked. Our cover story was that we were working at various warehouses that stocked food for grocery stores. An excuse Mikey thought up. After a few hours, Tim eventually had to leave for the day. And Mikey went with him since they lived in the same general area. I left to go to the tunnel entrance again. Deciding to simply rest while going over my observations of the combat with Adder. Her explanation of my combat patterns made sense to me. I had in fact been fighting many caged animals at the test chambers. And most of my protocols were based on that experience. In truth, the only drone I had really fought had been the Blade drone on the subway. And it had been one of my most challenging fights to date. All of my other experiences versus drones had been surprise attacks. Against opponents who I now knew had no idea what they were doing. Not if Adder. Or even Ifrit and Olsen. Were the standard. I definitely had to ask Adder to train me when I had the chance. Not only had she changed between widely different combat patterns on the fly. But while fighting she had sometimes managed to visibly disappear. Normally right before I hit the ground. It might have been a power. But somehow I doubted it. I just needed a little more information and I felt like I'd have the answer. After contemplating the combat data for a few hours, I had to get up and hunt rats for a while. I was simply too restless. For the first time ever I had resources to burn and an avenue of improvement that I wanted. Not just needed. To pursue. I was really looking forward to the upcoming job. My mask had beeped Sunday morning and informed me that there was a job at 10 p.m. For most of the daylight hours I had simply wandered around the city near Ashwood Estate. To pass the time. By this point I had mapped all the roads and walkways. And noted all the food dispensaries in the area. Categorizing them by price and how likely it was I could steal food from them and get away with it. Now I was waiting for the elevator in the corridor at 514 Ashwood Street. At 9:30. Like last time, Olsen again showed up to use this elevator. "Hello there. Tofu, right?" he asked. "Yes. Hello, Olsen." Just like last time, he was wearing a red shirt and blue leg coverings. Although it wasn't the same kind of shirt. Today it had buttons. The elevator dinged and the doors opened for us. It was a ways until the elevator would drop us off, so I decided to see what information I could get from him. So, You have worked for Hellion before, may I ask what it was like? Oh. Sure. Well, there isn't much to say really. Hellion sends us a job and we do it is really the sum of my experience. I never hired on as more than a part-timer. Most of the time it's working for some villain who paid Hellion to provide the muscle. Ah. Does this mean we won't actually meet Hellion herself? Oh no. You definitely will. She has to spend most of her time running everything now. But she used to be the real hands-on type. I met her plenty of times even though I never became a regular. I see. I don't suppose you would be able to tell me a little about the dangers we will be facing. First day jitters, huh? No worries. Even if you're wearing the skull mask you won't need to do much. Just do what the lieutenants tell you and it'll work out. I suppose. The conversation ended there. And the elevator doors soon opened to let us out. I followed Olsen to the same meeting room as last time. And there was a sign with an arrow on it placed next to one of the doors. Ah. Looks like we're meeting in the garage today, said Olsen. The hallway we entered eventually led to a large room filled with various transport devices. Some of the drones from the orientation were here. But most of the drones I didn't recognize. These were probably the regulars, as they tended to look more confident than the orientation drones. And their dark clothing also looked carefully assembled for the job. Belt pouches. Equipment. Backpacks. Weapons. I catalogued the items since they were what the veterans considered necessary. Rattleback worked among them. And was occasionally giving orders that the other drones hurried to complete. Imp stood with Viper and Ifrit next to a new drone that I hadn't seen before. It stood only a little taller than myself and Ifrit. And its custom mask didn't look like it was built for combat. Instead seeming to be mostly protective eyewear with assorted attachments. Its coverings consisted of a single brown full-body cover that had multiple loops and pouches, from which various devices hung. Imp waved me and Olsen over and we approached them. Hey Olsen. Tofu. Olsen, you remember Socket, don't you? Said Imp. I sure do. How's it been, old man? Replied Olsen, reaching for and shaking Socket's hand. Pfft. Old my arse. You'll wear out before my parts do. Guarantee it. Good ta have you back, Sonny, said Socket as he greeted Olsen with a wide smile. Imp spoke to me. Tofu. Let me introduce you to Socket. Rattleback handles all the logistics and equipment. But Socket here makes all the little things we can't live without. Like your masks and the fancy pants elevators. Ah. You made the mask, Socket. It is quite good. It does not hinder my senses at all, I said as I shook Socket's hand. Bah. That generic paperweight, stay with us for the long haul and I'll make you a real mask. He said it gruffly. But he shook my hand and smiled all the same. Good ta be getting so much young blood this year. Was afraid I'd be stuck with all these fuddy-duddies forever. They never want me ta upgrade their hunks of junk. Imp and Olsen both chuckled before Olsen replied. Maybe my memory is failing me. I seem to remember you kept wanting to add a bunch of horrible add-ons to the stuff you made right the first time. Changed your ways while I was gone. You're just stuck in the past is all it is. Wouldn't know a good upgrade from a slap in the face. That's the problem with old folks like you, retorted Socket. The three of them laughed together. It seemed they knew each other quite well. I felt just a bit better that Ifrit didn't laugh at whatever jokes they were making either, though. This humor thing still escaped me. And I was glad I didn't stand out too much. All right then, said Imp as he walked to a pile of items. Let's start handing out equipment. Tofu, you said you had regeneration, right? That is correct. All right. Here. This jacket looks about your size. And Imp handed me what seemed to be a thick, padded torso cover. That and your mask should keep your vitals from taking a full force hit. The jacket is not completely bulletproof, mind you. But it should do the heavy lifting. And your mask will block anything but the worst. Socket does good work. Oh. I figured the mask was tough when the rat couldn't scratch it. But it could take bullet fire. I slowly began shifting my core into my head. More equipment was handed out. And the rest of the minions eventually showed up. Including Gregor and Mikey. The equipment handouts were interesting. All of the minions received bullet-resistant jackets and a generic black helmet they could put on while wearing their mask. Gregor received an extra-large jacket. And Ifrit already had a bodysuit like Imp's. But Olsen didn't take any equipment at all beyond his mask and a crowbar. Once everything was set, Imp gathered all the new drones and gave us instructions. Alright everyone. In a moment we're gonna split you up into the vehicles and have you play right along. Tonight's job is a simple warehouse smash and grab. I go in with some of the veterans and the powers. And crack the place open. Once we're done you come in and start taking boxes out to the vans. If anyone at all shows up, drop what you're doing and run for the vehicles. Or just scatter and let your mask guide you to a safe house. Absolutely don't take your mask off until you've gotten back to base. Sometimes the heroes like to use trackers, and if they catch you with your mask off it can make the legal proceedings a lot harder. They started sorting the minions into the vehicles and Imp led me and the other powered minions to a van. This was interesting to me since I had only ever ridden on the subway. The inside of the van was rather bare. But it had utilitarian seats that could fit anybody along the sides. Even Gregor. Once everyone was in and adjusted, Imp started the vehicle and drove up a ramp that led swiftly upwards and into a very strange, reinforced-looking room. Once the entire convoy of vehicles entered the reinforced room, Imp pressed a button on the console in front of him. And the entire room started to move. These drones liked their transport devices just a bit too much. When I commented on the entire room being a transport elevator, Imp merely said it was to have multiple points of exit to keep the heroes guessing. I'm starting to suspect that drones simply enjoy not walking. The trip by elevator took 5 minutes. And then a metal door opened that led out into an empty street. The exit we emerged from looked like one of many similar buildings that stood in the area. Gray and lacking in details to distinguish them from each other. The section of Ashwood Estate we emerged from was on the eastern end of Ashwood Street, near the 900 numbered buildings. And we began traveling south. In a direction I hadn't yet mapped, unfortunately. Most of my efforts had been concentrated on Ashwood itself and north towards Maggie's Diner. The drive took a long time. Almost half an hour. Imp mentioned that the area we were heading towards was right near the border between E13 and S13. Eventually we entered an area where there were very few of the multi-level dwelling buildings. Instead they had been replaced by very large singular structures that Imp identified as warehouses. We drove past multiple structures that all looked alike. Until we came to one that had no visible difference that I could see. And parked in the area of flat space reserved for transport vehicles outside of it. Only one other van came with us. The rest of the convoy instead kept going. Imp turned to us once he parked the car. Alright you guys. Here's the plan. I'm going in first and making sure the security system is dead. The rest of you are gonna follow along behind me with Olsen. And he'll explain what to look out for and how to deal with anything unexpected. I'm not expecting any trouble at this first one since they don't have night workers. So it's gonna be like a show and tell. Once we're done cracking it open we leave and the minions will go in and clear it out. Our next destination will be the next warehouse. What's to stop the cops or heroes from showing up while we aren't here? Asked Gregor. Imp turned and sat straight in his seat again, looking out the front window. Hellions currently setting up for the party right now. All we gotta do is sit back and wait for the signal. What's the signal? I asked. Oh. You'll see it. No worries. Replied Imp. We waited in silence for about 15 minutes. Imp relaxing in the driver's seat and the rest of us fidgeting in the back of the van. But the signal did eventually come. And I did indeed recognize it. I thought it was the sun at first. The horizon. Long dark after the sun went down. Lit up again as an absolutely massive fireball rose into the sky. The shockwave from the blast rolled over us a few seconds later. And Imp slowly lowered his window after it stopped rattling. Yep. Said Imp. It's not really summer until the first big heat. Estimated size, 1 city block. That is a really big explosion. I replied. Yeah. I think she's trying to show off since we have so many newbies this time. Answered Imp. Anyways, it's time to go. I'll meet you in a bit. Remember to let Olsen lead the way in. And then suddenly Imp wasn't there anymore. It was unnerving how quiet his teleporting was. Ambushes would be so easy if I could do that. Olsen opened the side door on the van and we followed him out. Then Olsen began a leisurely walk to the warehouse. Shouldn't we be more stealthy? I asked. No point. Replied Olsen. Imp does the sneaky part of taking out the security alarms without setting them off. And there aren't exactly a lot of people around these kinds of places at night. Besides, you're in the capes and cowls business now. What's the point of wearing these awesome masks if no one ever gets to see them? Take it from me. Half the power of being a cowl comes from people running the other way at the sight of you. Need to represent the brand. Makes things a lot simpler and even safer in the long run. I suppose he had a point. Even if it was anathema to my usual way of doing things. Olsen led us to a door in the side of the building. It had one of those devices with numbered keys attached next to the door frame. And a tiny red light on it blinked steadily. Olsen waited for a few minutes and the light on the handle turned to green with a beep. Wait. Give it another sec. Olsen said when we started moving forward to enter. After one more minute the light blinked off completely and we heard a click from the inside as the lock disengaged. Sometimes even when the alarm looks like it is off. It isn't. Best to just wait until everything is dead. You can never be sure if they tried to get tricky with their security. He said as he opened the door. Why does the lock disengage when the power goes off? I asked. Because it's a fire hazard if they don't. Replied a raspy voice. Surprisingly it was Ifrit who had spoken. I had never heard her talk before. Her voice sounded like bits of dry paper scraping against each other. We entered into a small room and corridor system before we reached the warehouse proper. Inside of which we were met by Imp. He showed us some of what he had done. Mainly avoiding cameras and applying one of Socket's gizmos to the warehouse network. His method of entry was simply teleporting to and through a high window on the wall. There was no one else inside the warehouse. So we left and told the minions outside that it was clear to enter. Then we piled back into the van and headed for the next warehouse. Well. That was pretty uneventful. Just the way we like it. You guys got any questions? Asked Imp. I considered it before asking, what were we stealing? I hadn't actually seen anything I would consider valuable. There wasn't any food or money or weapons inside. Just a few odds and ends that Socket had on his shopping list. That warehouse is a storage and distribution center for several different electronics manufacturers. That's why we only had a van there. The next one will need one of the trucks. We drove for only a few minutes before coming to another warehouse. The truck we were meeting was already parked in the parking lot. And we wasted no time in exiting the van and heading to where Olsen indicated. This time went a bit differently than the last one. instead of the alarm going dead. The door was opened by one of the employees of the facility. The reason it let us in was Imp, standing behind him with one of his pistols out and in his hand. Again Imp led us inside to show us some of the security systems he had bypassed, while Olsen watched over a few warehouse drones that had been inside the facility. This warehouse made much more sense to me. It was filled with food. There were crates full of a variety of different food items. And parts of the warehouse were taken up by artificially cooled rooms that contained perishable items such as fresh fruit. Again I was impressed with the clever solutions drones employed to solve important problems. We left the warehouse, to my disappointment, and told the minions it was safe to enter. Olsen was assigned to stay with them since it was standard policy to keep a super around if hostages were involved. Apparently just the threat of superpowers was enough to keep them docile. The next warehouse was where things got interesting. Imp explained as we drove to our destination, "Okay guys. The next one is going to be a meat storage facility. It's going to have some security and they will most likely have guns. Nothing your jackets won't take. But I don't want you guys panicking if some of the guards start popping off on you. Tofu. Since you can regenerate, I want you in front of Gregor and Ifrit if you get caught out of cover. Think you can do that?" "Yes. As long as they don't shoot enough bullets to overwhelm me. They should be carrying handguns. About 10 to 20 shots depending on how cheap their bosses are feeling." "That sound okay?" "Yes. That should be fine." I had been worried for a second. The drones had used thousands of rounds on the yellow fur. If the guards here only had a few dozen, it wouldn't be enough to kill me. We arrived at the warehouse and Imp parked the van on the street next to the building rather than in the parking lot. The reason why being a small security checkpoint that separated the parking section from the main road. "Alright. Give me about 20 minutes to get the alarms down and then walk in like you own the place. Try not to kill the guards if you can. Just disarm them or send them running. This is the last stop of the night, so we don't need to keep it too quiet. The trucks will be coming in right behind you." Then Imp disappeared as he teleported onto the roof of the warehouse. We waited in the van like he said. And at the 20-minute mark left to enter the warehouse ourselves. As we approached the small security hut, I realized I had forgotten to ask Imp something. Exactly how do we walk like we own the place?" Gregor chuckled at my question and replied. "A little like this." He moved ahead of us and reached the security hut. A tiny structure with a yellow/black pole that provided a, rather flimsy, barrier to oncoming vehicles. There was a guard inside the room who was fumbling for his weapon. But Gregor ignored him. And instead he reached out and pressed against the pole until it simply popped off its mount. The guard abandoned its attempt to unholster its weapon, simply raising its hands and running away as fast as it could run, which wasn't very fast. How utterly perplexing. This was supposed to be security. This wasn't even slightly comparable to the soldiers I had seen in the test chambers. Why do they even bother hiring these guards if they are so ineffective? I asked. It's like Olsen said. Half the power of power is simply the threat of using it. They don't actually pay the guards enough to risk their lives defending this place. The guards are just hired to provide the image of security. We were both bluffing. He just folded first, answered Gregor. Interesting. We approached and entered the facility to meet up with Imp. Most of the guards or employees we encountered gave up the moment they saw us, dropping their weapons and walking or running away with their hands up. One security drone did try to ambush us by popping out from behind a corner. But he had waited too long and allowed us to close the distance. So I simply smacked the weapon from his hands. This resulted in an awkward moment where it just stood there hyperventilating until it collapsed on its own. Gregor laughed a lot at this. And even Ifrit let out a raspy chuckle. We met up with Imp. And the minions soon came in with 2 trucks and a van. I soon found myself staring at the amount of meat the minions were packing into the trucks. Gregor tried to tell me that some of the carcasses might be worth over $200 a pound. But I didn't believe him until Imp confirmed it. It didn't make logical sense to me. Paying $200 for a single pound of meat was inefficient when for the same price I could buy almost 20 tofu burgers. Even if burgers tasted terrible, which they didn't, the meat was simply too expensive to choose it over the nutrients you would get from the burgers instead. When I tried to ask Gregor why anyone would choose to buy the meat, he merely shrugged and said that rich folks have rich tastes. Either way, Imp promised we would keep some of the meat for ourselves, much to my delight. We were almost done loading up the trucks when Imp teleported from where he had been on a nearby roof into the middle of the group. "Alright guys, it's time to scramble. I just got word from Hellion. Turbo left the party early. Drop what you're doing and move." Instantly the veteran minions dropped whatever they were holding and scrambled for the trucks and vans, directing the new minions on where to go. Tofu, go with the first truck. Gregor, second truck. Ifrit, go with the minions in the van, yelled Imp. All casualness gone from his voice as he teleported on top of one of the trucks. Guns drawn, to keep a lookout. I ran for the indicated truck and jumped into the passenger seat. The minion with me already had the engine running. And as soon as another minion closed the container doors, we were on our way. The driver aimed for the parking lot entrance and we almost made it. But then a blur crossed the lot in seconds and attacked the truck. First a brick hit the windshield and cracked the glass. Then the driver's side door flew open and my driver was pulled from his seat and flung 10 feet away. I was slammed into the front dashboard when the blur hit the brake pedal. And then it was gone. Almost immediately I heard gunfire as Imp engaged what must have been Turbo. Estimated threat, very high. Preparing defense protocol, speedster. I was already shifting as I got up from my seat and went for my driver. I didn't know how to drive this truck. He was outside on the floor. But luckily he was uninjured and I went to help him. I pulled him up from the ground and we ran for the truck. Him in front of me. The driver reached his seat and punched out the broken window, while I latched onto the door frame and held on as we started to move, scanning for Turbo as we did so. Apparently teleporting was a good defense against speed because Imp was still firing away to try and keep Turbo away from the trucks. And every time Turbo tried to close on him he simply moved his position and kept firing. But when the first truck began to move, Turbo predictably went after us again. Some interesting facts about Turbo. He has super speed. It's fast. But he has to push himself to dodge a bullet that's aimed directly at him. He can accelerate objects he carries. But if he throws them, they only have the normal force they would have had if he was traveling at normal speed. A strange quirk of his power. He does not have super strength. He is not super durable. He does not have regeneration. And so when he tried to grab me, he triggered one of the whiskers I had been extending. And my leg automatically lashed out, breaking his leg. I owed Tim lunch. I had been planning countermeasures against Turbo ever since I first saw him on Ashwood Estate. My idea had come from the rats in the sewers. They used whiskers to sense things before they ran into them in the dark. And with Tim telling me all the factoids of the local hero, I had made an estimate of how fast I would need to move to catch him by surprise. True. I had also broken my own leg in doing so. And used an entire cycle's worth of energy to move that fast. And now that I look again, I don't think Turbo's leg is actually broken. Only injured. He's still limping around rather quickly. Dang. At least it slowed him down enough for Imp to get some clear shots. As Imp increased his barrage, my driver stomped the gas pedal and the truck swerved out onto the street. Followed soon after by truck 2. And the van full of minions. We quickly split up and went different directions, trying to make sure that the hero couldn't go after all of us. We traveled for several minutes before my driver spoke up. "Do you want to come back in the cab?" he asked. "That's okay. I'm good." "All right. Nice work back there, by the way." "Thank you." "Is this how most jobs typically go?" Driver laughed and replied. "Yeah. Just about." Then he frowned as he noticed something in the sky and said, "And I don't think this one is over just yet." I followed his gaze. And hanging in the sky was a flying drone. This one had a purple glow to it as it slowly flew down to a closer position in front of us. "Would that be Magenta?" I asked the driver. "Yep. Any details you can give me about her?" "She makes that purplish force field around herself. It's strong and she can make weapons out of it too. Claws and swords and stuff." "Oh. And she can fly, of course." "Understood. I'll try to lead her away. Be ready to drive." "You sure?" "Yeah." "How far away is Ashwood Street from here?" "About 25 blocks north." "Okay. Good luck." "You too." I jumped down from the truck. And he started to drive away. Magenta started to fly after him when I yelled as loud as I could. "If you don't stop me, I'm going to hurt people." "Yeah." That got her attention. If the Guardian's behavior was typical of heroes, then she would prioritize coming after me rather than pursuing a truck. She did seem to hesitate for a second. So I took out my knife and waved it around. That helped her decide. And she accelerated towards me. I ran for it. I didn't really have the time or interest to grab a hostage, of course. The streets were almost empty due to how late it was and odd summer warnings. Instead, what I wanted to find was an entrance to the sewers. I swiveled my head backwards every now and then to keep an eye on her as I ran. She was moving just a bit too quickly for my liking. She wasn't a speedster. But flying was definitely faster than running. And even though I was running on all four limbs and burning fuel to stay ahead of her, she was still gaining fast. Yeah. This wasn't going to work. I ran for the nearest building. A multi-level apartment. I scanned the windows for a good candidate and ran straight for it. This one was lit. And showed two drones drinking what I assumed was coffee at a table. Swinging an arm forward, I shattered the glass and barreled into the room. Heralded by screams from the two drones. I was wrong about the coffee. They were drinking tea. I knocked the table over as I entered, sending cups and glass flying. Now, if this apartment followed the same design principles as the ones Tim and Mikey lived in, then the entrance should be here. I smashed the door open and then continued into a different apartment, smashing that door down too. At this point I was using traction claws on all four limbs. And I used them to maintain speed as I ducked around corners and smashed past random furniture. Drones screamed everywhere. I busted out of the window in the new apartment and landed in the street on a new side of the building. Hopefully that would buy me a few moments as she checked the civilian drones for injury. Scanning the area, I found what I wanted. A manhole cover. I barreled towards it. And upon reaching it, stuck a claw into the small hole maintenance drones used before wrenching it open. Then Magenta slammed into my side. Her force field was encasing her hands, making them look oversized. And she pummeled them into me. Each hit broke a bone. "Surrender now. You are under arrest," she yelled between hits. Instead of doing that, I swung the manhole cover into her face. It knocked her away. But her force field was indeed strong and she looked untouched, if a bit dazed. Touching the force field felt like I was sliding across wet glass. Or being blown away by a strong wind. I settled for throwing the manhole cover at her and dived for the sewer entrance. I was almost there when she tackled me around the middle and pulled me to the ground. Damn. My torso was hanging over the hole, but she had a firm grip. And the force field was wrapping tighter by the second. I wasn't going anywhere unless. Please. Not so tight. It hurts. I yelled. Yeah. Surrender before you hurt yourself. She replied. I triggered the micro units in the area she held me. They quickly self-destructed, rupturing the surrounding tissue and causing it to tear. My torso separated from my lower half with a spray of blood. And I made sure that some viscera spattered into her face. The force field blocked it. But it obscured her vision as my upper half and my core fell into the safety of the darkness below. I listened to her yells as I fell, and lamented the fact that I hadn't been able to plan for this ahead of time. I lost a little more than half of my mass and resources to pull off that escape. And the loss stung. That Kobe beef Gregor was talking about better be worth it.